The sun over the Grand Erg Occidental did not merely shine. It functioned as a physical weight, a golden hammer beating against the shifting silicate of the Algerian Sahara. In the heart of this incandescent furnace, beneath a shelf of calcified sandstone, a life began in a pocket of shadows that smelled of cool earth and maternal musk. Kalen was the last of 3 to be born, and from the moment his mother, Mira, licked the amniotic fluid from his coat, the difference was stark. While his siblings were robust, their tiny paws already kneading the sand with vigor, Kalen's left hind leg was twisted inward, a withered reed of bone and fur that refused to support his weight. Mira, a fennec fox of seasoned instinct, nudged him toward her belly. She did not reject him, but the desert was a cruel accountant, and Kalen was born into a deficit. His ears, however, were his heraldry. Even as a kit, they were disproportionately vast, translucent fans mapped with a complex delta of crimson veins. They were not merely organs of hearing. They were his radiators, his cooling towers, and his connection to a world that most of the desert's denizens could never perceive. As the weeks bled into a blur of searing days and obsidian nights, the struggle for Kalen became a rhythmic ordeal, while his siblings, Jace and Alara, tumbled in the mouth of the burrow. Practicing the pounces that would one day secure them gerbils and locusts, Kalen moved with a lopsided, dragging gait. He was a creature of 3.5 legs, a hitch in his step that made him slow and vulnerable. But where he lacked speed, Kalen possessed a terrifyingly acute focus. He would sit for hours, his massive ears swiveling like independent radar dishes, catching the thermal whispers of the dunes. He learned to read the desert through sound. He could hear the subterranean rustle of a darkling beetle 3 feet beneath the surface. He could hear the distant, crystalline vibration of a sand viper's scales as it slid over a dune half a mile away. Most importantly, he felt the heat. He learned how to tilt his head so the rare, wandering breeze could pull the warmth from the blood vessels in his ears, cooling his entire body before the midday sun could boil his spirit. The year of Kalen's youth was the year the great drought descended. The seasonal rains, usually a brief, violent blessing, bypassed their sector of the erg entirely. The scrub brush died, turning into skeletal gray husks, and the prey animals began to migrate or perish. The competition for the remaining fertile pockets, low-lying wadis where the sand still held a ghost of moisture, became a war. The patriarch of the neighboring territory was a scarred, aggressive fennec named Zane. He was a brute of a fox, his coat matted with the dust of 100 kills. When the drought tightened its grip, Zane expanded his borders, driving Mira and her brood toward the Dead Sea of the Erg, a vast expanse of towering, shifting dunes where there was no cover, no shade, and no mercy. Jace and Alara, strong and fast, managed to stay ahead of the pack, but Kalen fell behind. His twisted leg dragged, carving a jagged line in the sand that acted as a trail for any predator. Mira stayed with him as long as she could, her eyes bright with a desperate maternal grief, but the desert demands hard choices. When a pair of jackals began to circle their scent, Mira had to lead the able-bodied kits away to draw the predator's attention, leaving Kalen hidden in the hollow of a sun-bleached ribcage of a long-dead camel. Kalen lay in the parched shadow of the bone, his chest heaving. The temperature was climbing toward its lethal peak, 120 degrees Fahrenheit, in the shade. To any other creature, this was a death sentence. But Kalen's evolution had gifted him a mechanism of survival that transcended his physical deformity. He didn't panic. He flattened his body against the coolest layer of sand he could find and began the ritual of the ears. He dilated the vessels in those massive, leathery sails, allowing his pounding heart to pump the overheated blood into the thin, exposed skin. The slight movement of the air, heated though it was still cooler than his internal temperature. It was a delicate biological trade-off, a thermal bypass that kept his brain from cooking. Hours passed. The jackals, frustrated by Mira's deceptive maneuvers, eventually gave up the hunt, their own cooling systems failing them in the midday glare. They retreated to the deep shade of distant rocks. Kalin, however, remained in the open, a ghost in the heat. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange, Kalin heard it. It wasn't a sound of a predator, nor the skitter of prey. It was a low-frequency hum, a vibration that traveled through the very bedrock beneath the sand. It was the sound of water, not a pool or a stream, but a deep, pressurized pocket of ancient moisture trapped beneath a layer of shale. Miles away but echoing through the dunes, he began to move. His gait was a harrowing, three-legged hop, his withered limb trailing like a broken anchor. He didn't follow the paths of the others, he followed the hum. Days passed into a singular, grueling journey. Kalin became a specter of the dunes. He avoided the oases, where Zane and his clan fought over the last muddy puddles. Instead, he pushed deeper into the Dead Sea, into the furnace where no fox should survive. He survived on the moisture of Dulik stones at dawn. And the occasional moisture-rich tuber he detected deep beneath the surface using his sonic mapping. On the 5th day, the heat broke records. The air became a shimmering wall of distorted light. Kalin reached a depression between two massive, crescent-shaped dunes. Here, the hum was a roar in his ears. His ears, now dusted with fine silt, picked up a change in the air pressure. A storm was coming, not a rainstorm, but a ghibli, a sandstorm that could strip the fur from a creature's back. He saw them then, Mira, Jace, and Alara. They were huddled under a crumbling ledge of sandstone, exhausted and dehydrated. They had been driven here by Zane, who stood atop a nearby ridge, his own ears tattered and drooping from heat exhaustion. Zane was the alpha, the strongest, but he was reaching his limit. He didn't have Kalin's refined sense of the Earth's architecture. Zane was trying to survive by dominance. Kalin was surviving by resonance. The ghibli hit with the force of a tidal wave. The world turned orange, then black. Sand became a liquid, choking everything. Mira and the kits tried to huddle together, but the wind was tearing at their shelter. Zane, caught in the open, was forced to turn tail and run, his superior strength useless against the suffocating wall of grit. Kalin didn't run. He leaned into the wind, his vast ears pinned back against his skull to protect the delicate membranes, but still sensing. Still feeling the vibration of the earth. He hopped toward his mother, his twisted leg catching on the swirling debris, but he didn't falter. He reached them and began to dig. He didn't dig just any hole. He dug at a specific angle, against the lee of a buried rock he had heard beneath the surface. He used his front paws with a frantic, rhythmic energy, clearing a space. Mira joined him, her instinct finally aligning with his vision. Together, they excavated a deep, narrow tunnel that bypassed the surface heat and tapped into the cool, stable temperature of the deep sand. As they descended, the roar of the ghibli faded into a muffled thrum. And then Kalin hit the shale. He barked a sharp, high-pitched sound and began to scrape at a hairline fracture in the stone. A miracle of the desert followed. The pressure of the shifting dunes above, combined with the geological stress of the drought, forced a tiny, crystalline seep of water through the crack. It wasn't a geyser, it was a slow, rhythmic weeping of the earth. They drank. The water was metallic and ancient, but it was life. When the storm passed 2 days later, the landscape had been rewritten. The oases were buried under tons of new sand. Zane was gone, his tracks erased, his strength proven insufficient against the sheer scale of the Sahara's wrath. Mira, Jace, and Alara emerged from the burrow, their coats dusty but their eyes bright. They stood on the crest of a new dune, looking out over a world that belonged to the patient and the perceptive. Kalin was the last to emerge. He limped to the top of the ridge, his withered leg a testament to his struggle, but his ears, those magnificent, oversized sails, were held high. He swiveled them, catching the first cooling breeze of the evening. He heard the return of the insects, the distant call of a nightjar, and the heartbeat of the desert itself. He was no longer the weakling of the litter, he was the navigator. He was the one who could hear the water in the stone and the wind before it arrived, in the harsh, unforgiving theater of the Sahara, where speed and strength, often burn out under the relentless sun. The fox who listened to the heat had become the master of the dunes. He stood there, a small, three-legged silhouette, against a rising moon. A living proof that evolution's greatest gifts are often hidden in the parts of us that seem the most out of proportion. Kalen didn't just survive the desert. He understood it, and in that understanding, he found a strength that no perfect limb could ever provide. The silence that followed the Ghibli was more terrifying than the roar of the wind had been. It was a heavy, suffocating stillness that felt as though the desert itself were holding its breath, waiting to see who had survived the burial. Beneath the recalculated dunes, within the cool, narrow sanctuary Kalen had engineered, the 4 fennec foxes huddled in a knot of fur and rhythmic breathing. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the metallic tang of the ancient water they had scavenged from the shale. Kalen lay at the mouth of their tunnel, his oversized ears pressed flat against the ceiling of the burrow. He wasn't listening for the wind anymore. He was listening to the weight of the world above them. He could hear the settling of billions of grains of sand, a sound like a million tiny glass beads rubbing together. He felt the shift in pressure as the sun began its ascent, baking the new surface of the Sahara into a crust. Beside him, his brother Jace stirred. The once boisterous Kit was subdued, his coat matted with dust, his eyes wide with a newfound realization of his own fragility. Jace looked at Kalen's withered leg, the limb that had always made Kalen the target of his play fighting, and for the first time, there was no judgment in his gaze. There was only a quiet, desperate reliance. Mira, their mother, nudged Kalen's flank with her nose. She was the matriarch, the one who had led them through a dozen droughts, yet she now deferred to her smallest son. The weeping stone he had found was already beginning to dry. The geological stress that had squeezed the moisture from the rock was equalizing. They couldn't stay here. The burrow was a tomb if they didn't move soon. Kalen stood, his movement stiff but purposeful. He didn't need to see the surface to know it was changing. His ears swiveled, catching a low-frequency vibration, a distant, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through the very bedrock. It was the song of the sands, a phenomenon where the shifting of specific dunes created a low, booming drone. To a human, it was a haunting mystery. To Kalen, it was a compass. Follow, he seemed to signal with a flick of his tail. They emerged into a world that had been erased and redrawn. The landmarks Mira had used for years, the lightning-scarred acacia. The jagged outcrops shaped like a camel's hump were gone, swallowed by the shifting gold. The horizon was a seamless line of blinding white heat. The temperature was already climbing toward a lethal 110 degrees. As they began their trek, Kalen took the lead. His limp was pronounced on the soft, unstable slopes, but his focus was absolute. He didn't look at the horizon, he looked at the air. His ears, those massive, delicate sails, were held wide to catch the slightest thermal. He was monitoring the heat signatures of the landscape, feeling the cool pockets where the sand was deeper, and the hot zones where the sun-baked rock lay just beneath the surface. By midday, the heat became a physical weight. The group's pace slowed. Ilara, the smallest female, began to stumble, her tongue lolling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Fennecs are masters of heat, but even their specialized biology has its limits. Their kidneys were working overtime to conserve every drop of moisture, and their heart rates had slowed to minimize internal heat production. Kalen stopped. He turned his head 180 degrees, his ears twitching. He didn't hear water this time. He heard a tearing sound in the upper atmosphere. It was faint, a high-pitched whistle that would have been invisible to any other creature. A lanner falcon. The predator was a speck against the sun, a feathered scythe circling on the thermals. It was waiting for a movement, a shadow, a sign of weakness. In the open expanse of the new dunes, there was nowhere to hide. The golden fur of the fennecs, usually the perfect camouflage, offered little protection against an eye that could resolve a beetle from 1,000 feet. Kalen barked a sharp, percussive warning. He didn't tell them to run. Running would only signal their position to the falcon's motion-tracking vision. He signaled them to melt. The family dropped, pressing their bellies into the scalding sand, pulling their limbs tight. Kalen, however, remained slightly upright. He was watching the sound. He could hear the falcon's wings adjusting the microscopic rustle of primary feathers as the bird began its stoop. Whir, whir, whoosh. The falcon dived. It was a blur of slate gray and lethal speed, descending at over 100 miles per hour. Kalen waited until the very last second, until he could hear the wind whistling through the bird's talons. Then he didn't run away. He lunged toward a nearby clump of parched, skeletal scrub that had been partially unearthed by the storm. The falcon, committed to its trajectory, tried to adjust. But Kalen's sudden, erratic movement, a zigzag powered by his one strong hind leg, and a desperate pivot threw the predator off. The falcon's talons raked the empty air where Kalen had been a millisecond before, and its momentum carried it dangerously close to the jagged, thorny branches of the dead scrub. The bird shrieked, a sound of frustrated fury, and beat its wings hard to regain altitude. It wouldn't risk a second pass in such close proximity to the thorns. It spiraled upward, seeking easier prey elsewhere. Mira rushed to Kalen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She licked his ear, a gesture of profound relief. The weakling had just outmaneuvered the sky's most efficient killer. But the reprieve was short-lived. The heat was intensifying. Kalen's ears were now bright pink, the blood vessels dilated to their maximum to dump heat into the air. He needed to find a dead wadi, an ancient underground riverbed, where the roots of long-dead trees might still hold pockets of humidity, or where the sand remained cool enough to survive the afternoon peak. He tilted his head, closing his eyes to shut out the blinding glare. He focused entirely on the acoustic landscape. He heard the scurrying of a dung beetle 3 dunes away. He heard the dry friction of a horned viper sliding beneath a ledge. And then he heard it, a low-frequency resonance, a hollow sound that indicated a cavernous space beneath the earth. He led them toward a series of low, black rocks, the bones of the desert. As they reached the formation, Kalen began to sniff the air. It wasn't just the smell of dust. There was a faint, sweet scent of decay. He found the entrance a narrow crevice between 2 basalt slabs. It led down into an abandoned fagara, an ancient man-made irrigation tunnel built by a civilization that had vanished centuries ago. The tunnel was half filled with sand, but the air inside was 20 degrees cooler. They descended into the gloom. For the first time in days, the relentless pressure of the sun was gone. The family collapsed in the shadows, their bodies finally cooling. As the hours passed and the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the Sahara in bruised purples and deep oranges, Kalen didn't sleep. He sat at the entrance of the fagara, his ears swiveling like radar dishes. He was listening to the return of the night. He heard the pop of rocks cooling and contracting. He heard the distant, haunting cry of a golden jackal. And he heard something else, a rhythmic, heavy thudding. Something was approaching their sanctuary. It wasn't a predator. The sound was too heavy, too deliberate. It was the sound of hooves. A lone addax, the white antelope of the Sahara, was wandering the dunes, its spiral horns silhouetted against the rising moon. The animal was a ghost of the desert, nearly extinct, wandering in search of the same thing the foxes were: life. Kalen watched the great beast from the shadows. He felt a strange kinship with it. Both were specialists of the extreme, creatures defined by their ability to endure what would kill anything else. The addax paused near the fagara, its large, splayed hooves perfect for walking on sand, kicking up a small cloud of dust. It sniffed the air, sensing the moisture trapped in the old tunnel, but it was too large to enter. With a low grunt, it moved on, a silent titan of the waste. The encounter solidified something in Kalen. He realized that the desert wasn't just a place of death. It was a vast, interconnected web of vibrations and echoes. To survive, one didn't need to be the strongest, like Zane, who had relied on muscle and dominance. One needed to be a part of the frequency. That night they hunted. With the temperature now a pleasant 70 degrees, the desert came alive. Kalen led Jace and Alara to a patch of sand where he could hear the frantic scritch-scratch of sand-swimming skinks. "Listen," he seemed to urge them. Jace tried, his ears twitching, but he was too impatient. He lunged at a shadow and came up with a mouthful of sand. Kalen, however, waited. He tilted his head, triangulating. He could hear the skink's heartbeat, a tiny, rapid drum beneath 4 inches of grit. Wait, strike. Kalen's head darted forward. He didn't use his paws, he used his precision. He emerged with a fat, moisture-rich lizard in his jaws. He didn't eat it. He dropped it in front of Alara, who was still weak from the day's trek. By the time the stars, the eyes of the ancestors, were burning bright in the obsidian sky, the family was fed and hydrated. They sat together on a high ridge, the wind ruffling their fur. Mira looked at Kalen. In the moonlight, his oversized ears looked like silver wings. He was no longer the runt, the mistake of the litter. He was the soul of the pack. He had learned the most important lesson of the Sahara. The heat is not an enemy to be fought, but a language to be learned. The sun, the wind, and the sand were all speaking, and Kalen was the only one who truly knew how to listen. As the moon reached its zenith, Kalen let out a long, high-pitched yip. It wasn't a cry of distress or a call for help. It was a declaration. It echoed off the dunes, traveling miles through the clear, cold night air. It was the sound of a master claiming his domain. He turned his ears toward the south, toward the great erg of Bilma, a sea of sand that stretched for hundreds of miles. He heard the distant pulse of life, the burrowing of insects, the growth of hardy desert grass, the movement of far-off herds. The journey would continue, and the heat would return with the dawn, but Kalen was not afraid. He closed his eyes, his ears still wide, still sensing, still mapping the infinite. In the heart of the world's harshest wilderness, the little fox with the broken leg and the giant ears had found his rhythm. He was the navigator of the silence, the prince of the dunes. And as long as the earth vibrated with the song of existence, he would lead his family home. The desert was no longer a wasteland, it was a symphony, and Kalen was its conductor. He lay down at last, his ears resting against the cooling sand, listening to the heartbeat of the world until the first light of the sun began to turn the east into a river of fire. He was ready. He had always been ready, for in the kingdom of the sun, the one who hears the shadows is king. The river of fire arrived not with a roar, but with a suffocating silence. As the first hem of gold brushed the horizon, the coolness of the night vanished as if it had been a hallucination. For Kalen, the shift was more than a change in temperature. It was a shift in the very texture of the air. His massive ears, those delicate, velvet-skinned sails, began to tingle. The blood vessels within them dilated, prepping the radiator of his body for the onslaught of the Saharan furnace. But today, the air felt different. It was heavy, laden with a static charge that made the fine hairs on his nape stand on end. While Jace and Alara were busy shaking the night's sand from their coats, Kalen stood perfectly still, his head tilted toward the east. He wasn't looking at the sunrise. He was listening to the pressure. Beneath the rhythmic breathing of his family and the distant scuttle of a scarab beetle, there was a low-frequency hum. It was a sound, so deep it was felt in the marrow of his bones rather than the drums of his ears. It was the sound of the atmosphere groaning. Move, Kalen's posture signaled. He nudged Mira, his mother, who looked at him with eyes clouded by the exhaustion of the previous night's hunt. Zane, the eldest brother who still carried the scars of his arrogance, snorted and tried to settle back into a shallow scrape in the sand. To Zane, the morning meant sleep. But Kalen nipped at his flank, a sharp, authoritative snap that startled the larger fox. Kalen's ears were swiveling frantically now, catching the first whistling notes of a wind that hadn't yet reached the surface. Above them, the sky was no longer blue. It was turning a bruised, sickly violet. The simoom was coming, the poison wind, in the Sahara. The simoom is a legendary killer, a dry, dust-laden blast that can raise temperatures to a staggering 130 degrees in minutes and choke the lungs with pulverized stone. To remain on the open dunes was a death sentence. The Sahara they had inhabited was too shallow, too prone to being choked by shifting drifts. They needed solid ground. They needed the Black Teeth, a jagged outcropping of volcanic rock 3 miles to the north. Kalen began to run. His 3 good legs worked with a rhythmic, hopping grace, while his withered limb tucked tight against his chest. He was a creature of kinetic energy, a tawny blur against the rising orange haze. Behind him, the family followed, driven by a primal fear they didn't fully understand, but sensed through Kalen's urgency. As they ran, the world began to disappear. The horizon vanished into a wall of copper-colored fog. The sun, once a blinding disk, became a pale, ghostly coin, filtered through 1,000,000 tons of airborne grit. The wind arrived then, a searing breath that felt like the opening of an oven door. It howled against Kalen's ears, a chaotic wall of white noise that threatened to drown out his internal compass. This was the ultimate test of his gift. In the blinding dust, sight was useless. Smell was overwhelmed by the scent of parched minerals. Touch was a barrage of stinging sand. Kalen had only his hearing, but the wind was trying to scream him into submission. He closed his eyes. He didn't need them. He focused on the shadows of sound. He could hear the way the wind broke against the distant rocks, a sharp, whistling thrum that was different from the whoosh of the open dunes. He could hear the heavy, solid silence of the Black Teeth, a sonic void in the middle of the storm-esque cacophony. He steered his family toward that void. Halfway there, Ilara stumbled. The heat was reaching a critical point, and her smaller lungs were struggling to filter the dust. She let out a soft, wheezing whimper. Kalen stopped instantly. He circled back, his own heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He could feel his ears burning, the heat dissipation working at maximum capacity, but the air was so hot there was nowhere for the warmth to go. He pressed his cool nose against Ilara's ear, sharing a moment of shared breath, then gripped her scruff. He couldn't carry her, but he could anchor her. The storm reached its zenith. The sky turned black in the middle of the day. Static electricity danced in the dust, blue sparks snapping off the tips of their whiskers. It was a world of friction and fire. Then, through the roar, Kalen heard a deep, resonant clack. It was the sound of a stone falling into a crevice. It was close. He pushed through a wall of sand that felt like walking through water. Suddenly, the wind changed. The screaming narrowed into a flute-like whistle. They had reached the base of the Black Teeth. Kalen felt the ground beneath his paws transition from soft, yielding sand to the unyielding, heat-soaked basalt of the ridge. He led them upward, his ears scanning for a specific frequency, the hollow, low-pitched echo of a deep cave. He found it behind a screen of fallen boulders. It was a narrow slit, barely wide enough for a fox, leading deep into the heart of the ancient rock. One by one he shoved them in, Zane, then Mira, then Jace. He practically threw Ilara into the darkness. Finally, Kalen crawled in himself. Inside, the world changed instantly. The roar of the simoom became a distant, muffled growl. The air was still hot, but it was no longer moving, no longer stripping the moisture from their very cells. The cave went back deep into the mountain, where the rock remained stubbornly cool from the winter months, a thermal memory of a different time. They huddled together in the dark, 5 sets of glowing eyes and 5 pairs of oversized ears. They were panting in unison, a frantic, wet sound, but they were alive. As the hours passed and the storm outside reshaped the map of the desert, Kalen lay at the mouth of the tunnel. He listened to the mountain. He could hear the expansion of the rocks under the heat, a series of minute pings and cracks that sounded like a slow-motion conversation. He could hear the vibration of the wind scouring the peak above them, stripping the stone. In the silence of the cave, Mira crawled toward him. She began to groom the sand from his ears, her tongue rough and warm. She lingered on the one that was slightly notched, the one that had spent the morning tilted toward the apocalypse. Kalen let out a long, shuddering breath. His leg ached, a deep, throbbing reminder of his fragility, but his mind was clear. He realized that the storm hadn't just been a danger, it had been a cleansing. The old tracks were gone, the old scents were erased. When they emerged, the desert would be a blank slate, and he would be the one to write their new history upon it. He wasn't just a fox with big ears anymore, he was the listener. He was the one who could hear the sun coming before it rose, and the one who could find the path when the world itself was being blown away. As the roar of the simoom eventually faded into a rhythmic, melancholic sigh, Kalen didn't sleep. He waited for the next note in the desert-s song. He waited for the sound of the cooling sand, for the first cricket to emerge from its burrow, and for the distant, liquid sound of an underground spring miles beneath their feet, calling to them through the stone. He was the conductor of their survival, and the symphony had only just begun. The silence that followed the simoom was not an absence of noise, but a heavy, pressurized weight that pressed against Kalen's eardrums. It was the sound of a world that had been scoured clean, a landscape that had forgotten its own history. Inside the basalt womb of the black teeth, the air had finally begun to settle. The frantic, wet, rhythmic panting of the skulk had slowed to a steady, rhythmic cadence of recovery. Kalen remained at the threshold of the cave, his body a living barricade between his family and the dying gasps of the storm. His oversized ears, those delicate tapestries of skin and blood vessels, were still flushed a deep, bruised crimson. They had worked overtime, radiating the lethal heat of their frantic flight into the stagnant air of the tunnel. Now, as the ambient temperature of the rock began to leach the warmth from his body, he felt a violent shiver rack his frame. It was the cold fire of exhaustion, the moment when the adrenaline ebbs and leaves behind only the raw, aching reality of a body pushed beyond its evolutionary design. Mira moved beside him, her presence a soft, warm pressure against his flank. She didn't speak foxes have no need for words when the tilt of a head or the scent of fear says everything. But she began to lick the salt and grit from the corners of his eyes. The sand had been like glass shards, microscopic and relentless. Kalen winced as she worked, his notched ear twitching. The mountain is settling, he thought, though the thought was more of a feeling, a vibration felt through his paw pads. Beneath them, the black teeth were groaning. To any other creature, the ridge was a silent, dead spine of rock. To Kalen, it was a cello. The cooling basalt contracted, creating a series of subsonic pops and sighs that echoed up from miles below. He tilted his head, his ears rotating like independent radar dishes, filtering out the surface wind to listen to the deeper resonance. There. It was a sound he had heard only in his father's most distant memories, a sound passed down through generations of listeners. It was a rhythmic, liquid thrum, a heartbeat of the earth itself, water, not the stagnant, bitter pools of the surface oases, but a deep, pressurized vein of life flowing through a limestone vein deep beneath the volcanic rock. But between them and that life-giving pulse lay a desert that had been transformed into a labyrinth of deception. Kalen stood, his legs trembling. His injured leg, the one with the old scar from a desert hawk's talons, felt stiff and unyielding. He looked back at the skulk. Zane and Jace were huddled together, their fur matted with dust, their eyes wide and glassy with the shock of the storm. Ilara, the smallest, was tucked under Zane's chin. Her breathing was still shallow, a raspy sound that tore at Kalen's heart. She had inhaled too much of the fine, silty dust. Her lungs were struggling to clear the silt that now coated their delicate linings. They couldn't stay here. The cave was a sanctuary, but it was also a tomb. Without moisture, the heat of the coming day would finish what the simoom had started. "We move," Kalen signaled with a sharp, authoritative flick of his tail. Mira looked at him, her eyes reflecting the dim light of the cave's mouth. She saw his limp, saw the way his ears sagged with the weight of his fatigue. She stepped forward, nudging Ilara upright, her movements firm but tender. They followed Kalen as he limped toward the blinding white glare of the new world. When they stepped out onto the ledge, the sight was enough to make even Kalen pause. The dunes they had traversed only hours before were gone. In their place stood a sea of undulating white silk, the sand reshaped into massive, razor-edged crescents that reached toward the cerulean sky. The horizon was no longer a flat line, it was a jagged, shifting wave. The air was unnaturally clear, the dust having been hammered back into the earth by the weight of the wind. But it was the heat that hit them first. Even in the early morning, the sun was a predatory eye. "Listen," Kalen whispered into the mind of his family, a command for total stillness. He closed his eyes. He blocked out the visual distractions of the shimmering heat haze and the blinding glare. He focused entirely on the acoustic landscape. He heard the sizz of sand sliding down the face of a distant dune, a sign of instability. He heard the clack-clack of a darkling beetle emerging from the grit, its hard shell clicking against a stone. But then he heard the danger. A mile to the east, buried under a fresh drift of sand, something was moving. It was a low-frequency vibration, a heavy, sliding sound that lacked the lightness of a fox or the frantic scurrying of a rodent. It was the rhythmic, muscular contraction of a horned viper, one of the great titans of the waste that had survived the storm by burying itself deep. The storm had left it hungry, and the vibrations of the fox's paws on the basalt were like a dinner bell ringing across the silence. Kalen adjusted their course, steering them away from the soft sand where the viper could move with invisible speed. He led them along the spine of the black teeth, where the rock was stable, though it burned their pads. As they descended the southern slope, the terrain became a graveyard of the storm's victims. They passed the carcass of a sand gazelle, its body half buried. Its eyes already gone to the crows that circled high above like pieces of charred paper. The sight sent a ripple of fear through the kits. Zane let out a low, mournful whine. "Eyes forward," Kalen's tail signaled. "Do not look at what the desert takes, look at what it gives." But the desert was giving very little. The heat was intensifying, the thermal ceiling descending upon them. By midday, the air would be a kiln. Alara stumbled again. Her small body was radiating heat she couldn't dump fast enough. Her ears were pale, a sign that her blood pressure was dropping, her heart unable to pump enough cooling fluid to the extremities. She collapsed in the shadow of a leaning boulder, her chest heaving in those terrible, wet gasps. Mira hovered over her, desperation in her eyes. She looked to Kalen, a silent plea for a miracle. Kalen felt the weight of his leadership like a physical burden. He was the listener, but hearing the water didn't mean they could reach it. The sound he had heard earlier, the underground pulse, felt miles away, locked behind layers of impenetrable stone. He moved away from the group, climbing a small outcrop of basalt. He needed a higher vantage point, not for his eyes, but for his ears. He needed to catch a thermal or a wind current that might be carrying the scent of moisture, or better yet, the sound of it. He stood on the edge of the rock, his forepaws braced against the heat. He expanded his ears to their fullest extent, the delicate muscles at the base of the auricles straining. He tilted his head back, exposing his throat to the sun, and began to scan the horizon in a slow, 360-degree arc. At first, there was only the roar of the sun, a white noise of solar radiation that hissed in his ears. Then there was the wind, a dry, mocking whistle. He pushed deeper. He ignored the pain in his leg, the hunger in his gut, and the sound of his own thudding heart. He reached for the ghost sounds, the echoes that bounced off the atmospheric layers, and then he heard it. It wasn't the deep pulse from before. This was different. It was a high-pitched, metallic tink-tink-tink. It was the sound of condensation, in a deep, shadowed cleft of the black teeth, where the sun never directly hit. The sudden drop in temperature during the storm, followed by the rapid rise of the morning, had created a localized pressure differential. Moisture from the deep aquifer, forced upward by the storm's pressure, was condensing on the underside of a massive, overhanging slab of granite. It wasn't a spring, it was a weeping rock. A slow, agonizingly deliberate drip of pure, cool water. "Follow me," Kalen barked, a sound of such raw command that even the exhausted Alara found the strength to lift her head. The journey to the cleft was a nightmare of vertical climbs and narrow ledges. Kalen had to carry Alara for the final 100 yards, his teeth clamped gently but firmly on her scruff, his neck muscles screaming under her weight. He moved with a focused, limping grace, his ears constantly scanning the rocks above for falling stones or the silent shadow of a golden eagle. They reached the cleft just as the sun reached its zenith. The entrance was a narrow crack, barely visible behind a screen of calcified scrub. As they squeezed inside, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of wet stone and ancient moss. And there, at the very back of the crevice, was the tink-tink-tink. A single, shimmering bead of water formed on the tip of a dark stone protrusion. It hung there, pregnant with the weight of the world, reflecting the 5 pairs of glowing fox eyes that watched it with religious intensity. It fell. Splash, it hit a small, natural basin in the rock, no larger than a fox's paw. Kalen didn't move. He stood back, his chest heaving, his ears finally beginning to cool. He nudged Mira forward. She, in turn, nudged Alara. The small kit approached the basin with trembling legs. She dipped her tongue into the water, a tiny, pink flicker of life. She drank, her throat working in small, rhythmic gulps. Slowly, the light returned to her eyes. The raspy sound in her chest began to soften as the moisture lubricated her parched lungs. One by one, the skulk drank. They didn't gorge, they took only what they needed, respecting the slow, deliberate pace of the weeping rock. When it was Kalen's turn, the water tasted of minerals and time. It was the coldest thing he had ever felt, a liquid sliver of the earth's soul. As the moisture hit his system, he felt his senses sharpen. The static in his ears cleared. He lay down at the entrance of the cool cleft, watching the shimmering, heat-distorted world outside. They were safe for now. The storm had passed, the water had been found, and his family was whole. But as he listened to the desert, Kalen knew their journey was far from over. In the distance, beyond the black teeth, he heard a new sound. It was a low, rhythmic thudding, the sound of many hooves hitting the sand. A migration. The storm had moved the herds. The prey was moving north, toward the distant scrublands. If they wanted to survive the season, they would have to follow. They would have to leave the safety of the rocks and venture back into the open, where the sand was a blank slate and the predators were hungry. Kalen looked at his notched ear, then at his sleeping kits. He wasn't just a survivor anymore, he was a pioneer. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen more deeply. He began to map the path ahead, not by the stars or the landmarks, but by the symphony of vibrations that stretched across the horizon. He heard the wind moving through the spines of distant cacti, the burrowing of sand sharks, and the distant, lonely call of a nomadic tribe's flute. The desert was a song, and Kalen was finally learning how to play his part. He would lead them through the silence, across the white wastes, and into the green fringe of the world. Because as long as he could hear the heartbeat of the earth, they would never truly be lost. He felt Mira's head rest on his shoulder. Her breathing was deep and peaceful. Kalen let out a soft, whistling sigh. His ears twitching in his sleep, as he began to dream of the rain that was falling 100 miles away. A sound like 1,000 tiny drums, calling them home. The dawn did not break, it shattered. It came as a violent, incandescent line of violet and gold that bled across the eastern rim of the black teeth, turning the cool shadows of the weeping rock into a memory. Kalen was the first to stir, his oversized ears rotating like radar dishes to catch the faint, rhythmic thrumming he had heard in his dreams. It wasn't a dream, it was the desert's heartbeat, the migration. He nudged Mira, whose fur was still matted with the dust of the previous day's trek. She blinked, her large, dark eyes reflecting the dim light of the crevice. Beside her, Alara and the other kits Caspian and Lyra lay in a tangled heap of tawny fur, their breathing synchronized and deep. They had survived the dehydration, but the desert was a relentless creditor. It would soon demand more. The wind has shifted, Kalen whispered, his voice a low vibration that traveled through the stone. The hooves are moving toward the Great Basin. If we stay here, the water will dry, and the prey will be gone. We move with the sun at our backs. Mira looked at the small, dripping basin. It was their sanctuary, but she knew Kalen was right. A fennec fox did not survive by clinging to the past, but by anticipating the future. She licked Alara's ear, a silent wake-up call that the kit met with a soft, protesting whine. They emerged from the cleft into a world that felt like the inside of a kiln. The white wastes lay before them a vast, blinding expanse of salt flats and gypsum dunes that separated the rocky highlands from the northern scrublands. It was a place where the sun didn't just shine, it reverberated. As they descended the jagged slopes, Kalen took the lead. His notched ear, a scar from a narrow escape with a horned viper years ago, twitched incessantly. He wasn't just looking for predators, he was listening to the earth. The salt flats were a treacherous acoustic mirror. Sounds bounced and distorted, making a distant beetle-s crawl sound like a dragging chain and a predator-s footfall nearly silent. By midday, the heat reached a terrifying 120 degrees. The kits were flagging, their small paws burning on the salt crust. Kalen redirected them toward a singing dune, a massive mountain of sand that hummed as the wind shifted its crest. He knew the physics of the sand. The leeward side of the singing dune held a pocket of air that was slightly mercifully cooler. "Walk in my shadow," Kalen commanded the kits. He fanned his ears out to their fullest extent. The blood vessels near the surface of the skin were dilated, acting as a biological radiator, dumping his internal heat into the air. It was an exhausting process, a constant battle against the laws of thermodynamics. Suddenly, Kalen froze. His ears didn't just twitch, they locked into a forward position. Thump, 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 it wasn't the migration. This was closer, low to the ground. Heavy under the crust, now, Kalen barked. Mira didn't hesitate. She grabbed Lyra by the scruff and dove into a shallow depression beneath a shelf of salt-hardened sand. Kalen shoved Alara and Caspian in behind her, then positioned himself at the entrance, his fur blending perfectly with the pale, crystalline earth. From the shimmering haze of the salt flat, a nightmare emerged. It was a desert monitor lizard, nearly 5 feet long, its scales the color of dried bone. It moved with a terrifying, splayed-legged gait, its flicking tongue tasting the air for the scent of fox. The monitor was a relic of an older world, a cold-blooded killer that thrived in the heat that wilted others. Kalen could hear the lizard's internal organs, the slow, rhythmic thud of its heart, the rasp of its lungs. It was close, 10 feet, 8. The lizard stopped, its head swinging slowly from side to side. It had caught the scent of the kits. Kalen knew he couldn't outrun it on the flats, and he couldn't fight it not with his weight. He had to use the desert against it. He didn't growl. Instead, he began to make a series of high-pitched, erratic chirps, vibrating his throat in a way that mimicked the distress call of a wounded sand grouse. To a human, it would have been barely audible. To the monitor, it was a siren's song. Kalen darted out from the shelf, limping intentionally, dragging his rear leg. The monitor's golden eyes locked onto him. The predator accelerated, its tail lashing the salt like a whip. Kalen led the lizard away from the crevice, toward the base of the singing dune. He could feel the vibrations of the monitor's pursuit through the soles of his paws. He waited until the lizard was a mere foot away, its jaws gaping to reveal a maw of serrated teeth. In that heartbeat, Kalen didn't run, he dug. He lunged toward the slip face of the dune, the unstable, steep side, where the sand was held in a delicate, gravitational balance. With a frantic burst of energy, he kicked at the base of the slope. The singing dune lived up to its name. A low, guttural roar erupted as the sand began to collapse. It was a localized avalanche, a river of granulated silica. Kalen, light and agile, skipped across the surface of the moving sand, but the heavy monitor was caught. The lizard hissed, struggling as the shifting weight of the dune dragged it downward, burying its powerful limbs in seconds. Kalen didn't stay to watch the lizard dig itself out. He circled back to the salt shelf in a wide arc, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Go, now. He urged Mira as he reached them. They ran. They ran until the sun began to dip, turning the white wastes into a sea of fire and indigo. They ran until the salt gave way to the first, tentative clumps of dry bunchgrass. As the first stars blinked into existence, Kalen felt a change in the air. It wasn't just the cooling temperature. It was a scent, a heavy, electric fragrance that made his whiskers tremble. Petrichor. Rain was falling somewhere to the north. The migration he had heard earlier finally came into view. Hundreds of Dorcas gazelles were moving across the horizon, their slender forms silhouetted against the rising moon. They were moving toward the scent of the water, toward the green fringe where the desert finally surrendered to the savanna. The skulk followed the trail of the gazelles. The kits were exhausted, their small bodies trembling, but the sight of the great herd gave them a second wind. They found a shallow wash where the gazelles had trampled the ground, revealing hidden tubers and the occasional moisture-rich succulent. Kalen stood on a small rise, his ears catching the distant, muffled sound of thunder. He looked down at his family. Ilara was pouncing on a flightless beetle, her energy returned. Mira was watching the horizon, her eyes bright with the reflection of the stars. He had brought them through the fire. He had listened to the silence and found the path. His notched ear caught a new sound, a soft, whistling wind through the acacia trees that appeared like ghosts in the distance. They reached the edge of the scrubland just as the first fat, heavy drops of rain began to fall. The water hit the dust with a sound like applause. The kits looked up, confused as the moisture slicked their fur. Then, with a realization of pure joy, they began to dance, spinning in circles as the sky opened up. Kalen sat back on his haunches, letting the rain wash the salt from his coat. The heat was broken. The journey of the pioneer was over, and the life of the skulk could begin anew. He closed his eyes, no longer needing to strain his ears for danger. For the first time in weeks, he simply listened to the rain, the most beautiful song the desert had ever played. He was Kalen, the one who heard the world, and he was finally home. The monitor lizard was a relic of a more violent age, a low-slung engine of muscle and scales that seemed to absorb the very light of the sun. As it pivoted on the salt crust, its flicking tongue tasted the air, deciphering the chemical signature of Kalen Esphere. To the lizard, Kalen was not a father or a pioneer. He was merely a calorie-dense prize, a soft-furred interruption in the shimmering heat. Kalen's heart did not just beat, it thrummed, a frantic rhythm that resonated in the sensitive hollows of his inner ear. He looked back at the crevice where Mira and the kits were huddled. He could hear Ilara's whimpering a sound like a rusted hinge, and it sharpened his resolve. He was small, perhaps the smallest of his kind, and his frame was gaunt from the weeks of drought. But he possessed a weapon the heavy-scaled predator did not, an intimate, acoustic map of the wasteland. The monitor lunged. It moved with a deceptive, lateral swaying of its body, its claws scratching the salt flats with the sound of 1,000 needles. Kalen didn't run away, not yet. He stood his ground until the predator was so close he could smell the rot on its breath. Then he began the song. It wasn't a growl of defiance, but a mimicry born of desperation. Kalen tilted his head, vibrating his throat muscles to produce a series of staccato, high-pitched chirps. He threw the sound, using the curvature of the nearby dunes to create an auditory illusion. To the monitor, whose hearing was tuned to the vibrations of struggling prey, it sounded as if a wounded bird was flapping just beyond the next rise. The lizard paused, its head tilting in confusion, its primitive brain momentarily jammed by the conflicting signals. Kalen seized the moment. He broke into a sprint, but it was a calculated, limping gait. He dragged his hind leg, kicking up plumes of white dust, playing the part of the easy meal. The monitor's predatory instinct overrode its confusion. It let out a low hiss and gave chase, its heavy tail whipping against the salt with enough force to shatter bone. The fox led the giant toward the base of the great singing dune. This was a place of legends among the desert dwellers, a mountain of sand held together by nothing but gravity and the dry breath of the wind. As Kalen reached the slip face, the steepest angle of the dune, he felt the heat radiating from the sand like a furnace. The monitor was closing the gap, 3 feet, 2 feet. Kalen could hear the clicking of its scales. In a move of suicidal grace, Kalen didn't climb, he dug. He threw his weight into the base of the unstable slope, his small paws working like pistons. He wasn't burrowing for safety, he was sabotaging the mountain. The silence of the desert was suddenly shattered. A low subterranean boom echoed through the earth, the singing of the dune. As the sand grains rubbed against one another, they created a massive acoustic vibration that felt like a physical blow. The delicate balance of the slip face failed. A localized avalanche of heavy, sun-scorched sand began to pour down. Kalen, light as a dried leaf, scrambled upward, his wide-set paws acting like snowshoes on the shifting surface. But the monitor, weighing 50 times more, was instantly betrayed by its mass. The more it struggled, the deeper it sank. The river of sand roared over the lizard, pinning its powerful limbs and filling its mouth with grit. It was a battle of physics, and the desert had chosen its victor. Kalen didn't wait to see the lizard struggle free. He crested the dune, his chest heaving, and looked back. The monitor was a mere speck, buried to its neck in the golden flow. He raced back to the salt shelf, his shadow stretching long and thin as the sun began its final descent. "Go, now," he urged Mira. There was no time for celebration. The scent of the lizard's kin or other opportunists would soon fill the void. They ran. They moved across the white wastes not as fugitives, but as a single, fluid shadow. Kalen led from the front, his ears swiveling 180 degrees, scanning for the slightest change in the wind. The kits, inspired by their father's return, found a reserve of strength they didn't know they possessed. Even little Alara kept pace, her tiny legs churning through the dust. As the sky turned a bruised purple, the terrain began to change. The blinding white of the salt gave way to the iron red of the scrublands. The first clumps of bunchgrass appeared, dry and brittle, but to the foxes they were as lush as a forest. And then it happened. Kalen stopped so abruptly that Mira nearly collided with him. He stood perfectly still, his nose twitching, his ears fanned out to their fullest extent. "Do you smell it?" he whispered. It wasn't the smell of sand or salt or death. It was a heavy, metallic fragrance that seemed to pull the moisture from the very back of his throat. Petrichor. The scent of rain hitting parched earth. A mile to the north, a massive wall of dark clouds had swallowed the stars. The horizon flickered with the silent, internal pulse of heat lightning. The migration Kalen had heard days ago finally emerged from the gloom, a ghost herd of hundreds of Dorcas gazelles. They were moving in a steady, rhythmic trot, their hooves striking the ground in a cadence that sounded like the heartbeat of the world. The skulk followed the trail of the giants. In the wake of the gazelles, the ground was churned, uncovering hidden treasures. Kalen found moisture-rich succulents that had been buried for months and tubers that tasted like pure life. They ate until their bellies were no longer hollow, until the kit's eyes regained their mischievous spark. Kalen led them to a small rise overlooking a dry riverbed. He sat on his haunches, his notched ear catching a new sound, a distant, low rumble that wasn't thunder. It was the sound of water, miles away, rushing down the mountain canyons to reclaim the dusty veins of the earth. Suddenly, the first drop fell. It hit Kalen right between his oversized ears, a heavy, cool weight that made him flinch. Then another, and another. Within minutes, the sky opened. This wasn't the gentle mist of the coast. It was a desert deluge, a violent, beautiful outpouring of mercy. The kits went wild. Alara let out a high-pitched yip and began to spin in circles, her fur matting down as she tried to catch the raindrops on her tongue. Mira stood beside Kalen, her shoulder pressing against his, her eyes closed as she soaked in the miracle. Kalen looked out over the landscape. The rain was washing away the salt, the blood, and the memory of the monitor's scales. He could hear the seeds beneath the sand, millions of them, literally cracking open as they drank for the first time in years. In a few days, this wasteland would be a carpet of green and gold. He realized then that his ears were no longer straining for the sound of predators. He wasn't listening for the hiss of a snake or the footfall of a jackal. He was listening to the rain, the rhythmic, percussive applause of the heavens. He was Kalen, the fox who had heard the water when the world was dry. He had led his family through the fire, not with strength, but with the wisdom to listen to what the desert was saying. As the kid Alara finally collapsed in a heap of wet, happy fur against his side, Kalen let out a long, shuddering breath. The journey of the pioneer was over. The migration was complete. He tucked his nose under his tail, the sound of the falling rain lulling him into the first true sleep he had known in a lifetime. He was the one who heard the world, and finally the world was singing a song of peace. He was home.